Hi, today we're diving into another corner of the Warhammer universe. And in looking at this Primarch planet, we find a place that, quite frankly, is one of the more heartbreaking and tragic entries in the entirety of the lore of the Primarch, in particular, where they come from. Now, if you look at modern Imperial records, you won't find much about this world, as it is listed as a dead world, and it was originally in the Ultima Segmentum, but even that is being generous, because the Inquisition essentially hit a delete button on its existence, including in the majority of records. They issued an Edict of Obliteration, trying to scrub the very memory of this place from the stars. And once you understand what happened there, and who was raised there, you'll understand why the Imperium is so terrified of its ghosts. On the surface, Nuceria appeared to be a rather civilized world, which in 40k terms means has electricity and some allusion to a functioning government. But underneath this thin veneer of nobility, it was an actual disgusting, vile meat grinder. The ruling elite lived in these massive glittering cities, like the Shesa, while the rest of the population was subjected to the cruelty of the world to a point that it was hard to wrap your head around how there weren't constant revolutions. Their entire culture revolved around gladiatorial pits, but these weren't the standard fights you would have seen the Romans have. They used something called the butcher's nails on some of their more extreme cases. This ancient forbidden technology was essentially surgical implants that were driven straight into the cerebral cortex and used to replace your ability to feel joy, peace, or contentment, and instead replaced that feeling with a ticking engine of pure, undiluted rage, pain, agony, and anguish. Basically, if you weren't fighting and engaged in combat or aggression, the spilling of blood, or destruction, the nails would bite into the meat of your brain, causing direct stimuli into the pain receptors of your body, creating a literal physical agony that was unbearable until you spilled blood relentlessly. Now, there is a small advantage to this. Your ability to feel pain from being injured while this is going on is severely dulled, and your adrenal system, along with your aggression, is boosted to insane levels. This is where the Primarch Angron landed after his mother scattered him and his siblings to the warp, with the Nuceria plan in sight. Now imagine being a literal demigod baby, a being designed to be a general, and in his case, a healer, someone with the psychic trait of empathy, being able to draw the pain from others into himself, essentially landing in the hands of slavers, thanks to the brilliant minds of the Eldari trying to prevent what they eventually just caused, weakening a child that should have and would have been able to escape the High Riders if not for their own attack. Now, these slavers didn't see a miracle, they didn't see a noble child, rather they saw a profitable asset. And eventually, once turned into a gladiator, Angron would have the butcher's nails shoved into his brain, making him the only Primarch who would be truly broken by the hands of humans and forced to kill for sport. But Angron wasn't just a killer. Even here, he was a leader, eventually leading a massive slave revolt and a desperate exodus of the broken and the damned. Eventually, they would become known as the Eaters of Cities. They were starving, they were dying, but for the first time in their lives, they were free. But overall, this is where the story takes a rather grimdark, or, depending on your view, a grimderp turn, and it honestly makes you want to put the book down when you're reading. Just as Angron and his gladiator brothers were about to make their final stand against the High Riders' army in a glorious last stand, all ready to die together in a blaze of glory, the Emperor of Mankind finally shows up in orbit. Now you'd think the God Emperor, who helped Mortarion, who helped a litany of his other sons finish the job, would descend, save the slaves, and ensure the loyalty of his son by winning the day against these rather technologically backwards armies. Unfortunately, the writers decided to have him just look at Angron's ragtag army of broken humans and decide they weren't worth his time. And he ignored Angron's howling pleas, literally teleporting him away from the world against his will, leaving his only true friends and family to be massacred in the dirt below. As Angron watched from his viewpoint, on a spaceship far above orbit, the people he loved were slaughtered. And for this, he would never forgive the Emperor, or the Imperium as a whole. That moment, that singular parental act of coldness, is the seed that would eventually lead to the burning of a large swath of the galaxy. Nuceria just didn't break a man, it broke a Primarch. And in doing so, it guaranteed that when the Horus Heresy finally kicked off, the Red Angel would be the first one in line to see the Imperium burn. But the story doesn't end with Angron leaving, because eventually, years later, he would come back, not of his own volition, as he had finally actually decided to just let it go. Forget about Nuceria. Forget about the High Riders. They weren't worth his time. But Lorgar had other things in mind. Plans within plans. You could say circles within circles. So with that brief overview done, and with you learning about both Nuceria and the Butcher's Nails, we have to go to the heart of the Imperium itself, Terra, to learn more. Hidden away in the deepest, darkest dungeons of the Library Sanctus is a book that functionally shouldn't exist. It's called the Librium Malium, and this isn't just some dusty old history book that the Adeptus keep around. Its pages are literally stained with uncountable amounts of blood. The legend goes that even just whispering its name is enough to risk total madness. It is essentially the ultimate do not read list of the 41st millennium, a record of every soul that has ever truly walked the path to total and complete damnation. This book is filled with the names of the most blasphemous heretics and tyrants you can imagine. People who sold their souls for even a flicker of power. But sitting right there at the very top of the list is the absolute final boss of betrayal. Here is Angron. The Librium Malium treats the Primarch of the World Eaters like the gold standard for what it looks like to lose your humanity. To the Inquisition and the high-ranking scholars of Terra, he isn't just a run-of-the-mill traitor. He isn't even just like the traitor Primarchs. He's a warning etched into the very fabric of reality. He is the Red Angel, a being whose name is synonymous with the kind of rage that shouldn't even be possible in our reality. But here's the thing, and this is what really messes with people's heads. Even with a book this forbidden and powerful, the record is still incomplete. Most of Angron's legend is functionally gone. It's so shrouded in dark myth and literal warp-tainted lies that the actual facts about Angron and his world are almost impossible to pin down with any sort of accuracy. You'd have better luck understanding what Alfarius truly has done throughout his existence. Functionally, we're looking through a looking glass that is stained with blood and viscera at a monster that used to be a man. And even the most secret and protected records in the galaxy can only give us fragments of the nightmare of who truly Angron was and how his world shaped him. It's like trying to piece together a puzzle where half the pieces are on fire and the other half are actively trying to scream at you to let them die. We know he was a Primarch, we know he was broken, we know he eventually became something much, much worse. But as we move forward, we have to realize that we're talking about a figure who has transcended regular history and entered the realm of pure cosmic horror. The Librium Malium tells us that he fell, but to see how he truly fell and to see what led to this abomination being as he was, and the ritual that finally ended his humanity on the sands of his own homeworld, we have to look at the bloodiest chapter during and prior to the Horus Heresy. Here is where things really start to get interesting when you narrow down the details. As you see, a very large portion of Angron's life was just missing from the records. It's functionally been scrubbed from the wider Imperium. We know the basics. The scattering of the Primarchs by a woman who had no plan and led to some of her sons being completely and totally brutalized, as those gestation capsules were ripped from the Emperor's secret labs and sent through literal space hell. And while we know where guys like Guilliman and Dorn landed, the name Angron Thulkir and his world was actually kept under a severe amount of lock, key, and secrecy. There's evidence that suggests the location was Nuceria, and that fact that it might actually still exist to some degree. This was kept deliberately secret by an inner circle of the early Imperium. If you dig deeper into the Speculum Historiae, which is basically a high-level historical text written by a legend from the Imperial Scholara, he describes Nuceria as this technologically advanced civilized world, but the term civilized here is being used extremely loosely. It's basically a high-tech nightmare ruled by a wealthy elite who live in these massive decadent palaces, and while everyone else rots in the slums outside their walls, it's a beautiful veneer with a classical dystopia living right under it. But here it's dialed up to 11 since it's Warhammer and you can't have nice things in Warhammer. So to keep the starving masses from realizing how truly horrible they had it, these oligarchic rulers came up with a distraction. This was the gladiatorial arenas. And it wasn't just guys with swords fighting each other or super cool sporting events like taking a oblong shaped ball from one end of around 100 to 200 yards to the other, but rather we're talking about a sport that was designed to take people who were literally rebuilt to be more efficient killers than even the most maddening of sociopath or psychopath could ever be, all to satisfy the endless bloodlust and quell the rage building up within a population that had nothing else to live for. It was a cycle of violence designed to keep the status quo as stable as possible, until a Primarch's capsule crashed right into the middle of it. The records were hazy on the exact circumstances of how he was found, but it is imaginable, and some other fragments of history do say that some Eldar attempted to prevent Angron from becoming the demon Primarch of Khorne due to their visions allowing them a glimpse into the future, thereby accidentally weakening him enough to be captured by one of those High Riders who found a literal demigod in the wreckage of the space pod after his battle with the vile Xenos scum. But rather than seeing a literal demigod, an angel, someone who could bring up their civilization to new heights, who could solve all their problems, they saw the ultimate gladiator. They saw a dark way to make their games even bloodier and more profitable. They took a being meant to lead humanity to the stars and turned him into a lab rat for their cybernetic experiments. This is the dark heart of Angron's story, and a large reason why he didn't even recruit from this world. The fact that his home was a place that saw a god and decided to put him in a cage and mutilate him is one of the greatest tragedies the 41st millennium has ever had to deal with. This all happened because a slaver was wandering through the jagged, freezing peaks of the Deshaliga Mountains in the northern part of Nuceria, and he stumbled upon something that shouldn't exist. He found a child, a young Primarch, battered, bleeding, and literally surrounded by a mountain of alien corpses. Now, the exact history of how this happened is a bit fuzzy on who the aliens were, but most Imperial scholars are pretty sure they were Craftworld Eldari. See, the Eldar are a psychic race, and they likely saw a vision of the absolute plague Angron would be on the galaxy, and they tried to Terminator him in the cradle to save the future from the past that they could not prevent. But much like almost everything the Eldar do, they failed. Ironically, by weakening him so much, they allowed him to be captured by the slaver, and they functionally ensured the very nightmare that the rest of the galaxy is now permanently dealing with, since Angron is not only a demon Primarch, but one who can respawn in basically a little bit over a week every time you kill him. These slavers then didn't see a demigod, they saw a paycheck, and hauled young Angron to the city of Deschia, specifically the Palace Praxia, and sold him to the ruling Tralkar clan. Once they realized the kid was a biological marvel who healed almost instantly from fights like a demon, they sent him straight into the biggest gladiatorial arena, the one in the capital, and they gave him a slave name, Angron Tralkir. Eventually, they would perform upon him a surgery that is the very definition of grimdark, edging to grimderp. They hammered in something that was called the butcher's nails into his brain meat, replacing significant chunks of his cerebral cortex with the arcane device. And now we really need to go into what the butcher's nails were, because the most messed up part is that this technology even existed in this setting at all. They are relics of the dark age of technology. Ones that are directly grafted into the cerebral cortex that don't just make you mad. They rewrite the entire concept of what mad is. They bleach the mind of reason, caution, and even natural instincts like self-preservation. Instead, they reward pure, undiluted aggression with electrochemical jolts of pleasure. Now, the irony of this description being one of the most iconic tools of Khorne's followers is hilarious, mind you, as now you have to imagine the brain of someone with these nails functionally having a ticking engine in their brain that makes everything except murder feel like physical agony, and slaughter feel like pure, undiluted, uncontrollable bliss, ecstasy even. And this was Angron's new reality. He was thrown into a cell with thousands of gladiators, all of them nailed just like him. and expected to be nothing more than mindless dogs for these high riders to enjoy. But here's the thing that makes Angron's story so compelling. Even with those nails ticking in his head, grinding away at his very being, he didn't lose his humanity immediately. He became a legend in the pits, a warrior of terrifying skill, but he actually had a sense of honor, unlike the high riders who sought to exploit him. He'd kill hundreds in the arena, but if a fighter showed true heart and fought well, he'd spare them. He wasn't just a killer, he was a leader. He loved his fellow gladiators like brothers and sisters. And while the crowds were screaming his name and even cheering for the Red Angel, he was secretly planning his revenge. He was a rather troublesome champion, someone who the High Riders just couldn't afford to eliminate, regardless of him always trying to break his chains and escape. And even though time and time again he failed, that spark of revolution never burnt out. He was a broken god in a cage, and he was finally reaching the point where he would snap. So jump forward a few years and Angron isn't just a gladiator anymore, he is a household name. The undisputed king of the pits. He is more recognizable than Michael Jordan ever was, and his fame spread to every single corner of Nuceria. But the thing is, Angron was smart, much smarter than an average human, even in his damaged mental state. He realized that after a few failed solo escapes that he couldn't break his chains alone. He needed his family to come with him. And during the biggest game the planet has ever seen, we're talking about the Super Bowl of deathmatches, Angron finally puts his plan into action and pulls the trigger on his ultimate scheme. Instead of putting on a show for the High Riders, the gladiators turn their blades on the guards, and in so they ensue chaos. They take heavy losses fighting against actual firearms with pit weapons amounting to swords, spears, balls and chains, etc. But about 2,000 of these gladiators managed to fight their way out of the city and vanish into the mountains. This is the birth of the Eaters of Cities. For the next few years, these rebels are like living ghosts in the peaks, and the rulers of Nuceria send army after army to put them down. But Angron, using that Primarch level tactical brain, despite it being partly dismantled and damaged, executes a masterclass in guerrilla warfare. But this is where the story actually starts to get bleak. I mean real bleak. They are winning battles, but it is a game of attrition. They're starving, they're freezing, and the butcher's nails are constantly screaming at their heads, wearing away at their sanity. By the time they reached the place called Feldermont on the Schlikas Ridge, they're down to about 1,000 souls. They've lost around half their full fighting force, and they're completely surrounded by 5 massive Nucerian armies, the best of the best of the best that world could produce. This was supposed to be it, the glorious final stand where they would all die free, side by side. And then the skies opened up, showing us the Emperor of Mankind. Now this is the part that bothers most people who find out about Angron's history. The Emperor didn't just arrive, he had been watching from orbit for months. He'd been setting this up like a proud papa, but one who was incredibly detached. This father was watching his son lead a revolt, and he finally teleported down to the surface. And can you imagine the scene? A literal god king appearing in the middle of a starving, ragged camp of slaves, with his golden guard in tow. The Emperor offers Angron everything: leadership of the 12th Legion, the Warhounds, a place at the head of a galactic empire, and the chance to leave this insignificant dirtball behind. It sounds like the ultimate rescue, right? But for Angron, this was his beginning of a resentment that would eventually lead to the breaking of the galaxy. And this is the moment where the Emperor of Mankind makes the single worst HR decision in the history of the galaxy. When he offers Angron the chance to leave, he expects gratitude. Instead, Angron looks at him and says no. Angron tells the Emperor that his place is in the dirt with his brothers and sisters, the Eaters of Cities, and that he'd rather die a free man on this ridge than live as a general for a father that he doesn't know. The Emperor is genuinely stunned. He doesn't see a family or honor. He sees these slaves, and he sees an irreplaceable genetic asset about to be wasted by a rabble on a backwater planet with no significance to the greater galactic scheme. To the Emperor, the math was simple. The Primarch was worth more than the people he loved. So the Emperor does something that Angron would never forgive. Rather than using the forces he has to easily and quickly eliminate the enemies of the slaves and take all of them to orbit, he waits for the armies to near, and then he just teleports Angron away, literally ripping him away from his family, who are currently being slaughtered to the last. They died thinking their leader had abandoned them in their darkest hour. To Angron, this wasn't a rescue, this was a soul-shattering betrayal, one that left a wound in Angron's psyche that would never heal, transforming his existing rage into a cold, permanent hatred for the man who stole his good death. When the 12th Legion, the Warhounds, finally met their long-lost father, they don't get a hero. Unlike any of the other Primarchs, they get a monster who is now shackled to the Emperor's will. Angron is so consumed by the grief of his loss and the ticking biting of the butcher's nails that he basically locks himself in a dark room and kills anyone who walks in. We're talking about high-ranking officers and veteran space marines just being turned into red paste because they tried to say hello to their dad, whom they are biologically and psychohypnotically trained to adore. This is what the Legion Master, Librium Malium, just disappears from history. There's no record, no explanation, and it's heavily implied that Angron simply ended him in a fit. So over the top, so drastic, that the Legion itself, the World Eaters, was too traumatized to ever talk about it. The only reason the 12th Legion ever survived this period and remained with their Primarch was a guy named Karn. He was a centurion who had the absolute largest stones, walking into Angron's chambers after 7 other men had walked in, then taking a beating that nearly killed him, but refusing to back down even in his bloodied and broken state. He showed Angron that Space Marines weren't just the Emperor's toys, they were soldiers, they were warriors, with their own code of honor, much like the gladiators that Angron had lost. And it worked! Angron finally, even if temporarily, snapped out of the shadows of who he was, and took command, but he made one symbolic change. He stripped them of their name and dubbed the Legion the World Eaters, as a tribute to his fallen eaters of cities. This actually was in part because a captain by the name of Drehegar stated that if Angron's old army could eat a city, then his new crew could eat worlds. To understand how Angron's story reaches its horrific climax involving the world of Nuceria, we have to look at what was happening in the wider galaxy. As the Horus Heresy had just kicked off, Lorgar, the Primarch of the Wordbearers, had a massive axe to grind. Years earlier, the Emperor had forced Lorgar and his entire legion to kneel in the dust as Reboot Guilliman and his Ultramarines watched. It was the ultimate humiliation as the Ultramarines burned his golden city, his tribute to the Emperor, to the ground. So as payback, Lorgar sent his top guys to absolutely devastate the Ultramarines at the Battle of Calth. But this wasn't just about revenge. The bloodshed at Calth was a ritual, which birthed the Ruinstorm, a monstrous galaxy-wide warp anomaly designed to cut off the realm of Ultramar and block any reinforcements from reaching Terra. So to keep this massive warp storm fueled, Lorgar teamed up with Angron and the World Eaters for what was essentially the most violent road trip in the galaxy. This was the Shadow Crusade, and they tore through the 500 worlds of Ultramar, wiping out 26 planets in rapid succession. The goal was to cause so much death and suffering that the boundary between real space and the warp would completely shatter. But during this campaign of absolute slaughter, Lorgar noticed something deeply concerning with his brother. Angron was deteriorating, and he was doing it fast, as the butcher's nails were never designed to be put inside a demigod's brain. They were never even designed originally to work or have their recipient survive for as long as he had. Angron's Primarch physiology was constantly trying to repair the damage the nails were doing to his brain. In response, the nails would just bite deeper and harder in order to maintain a strong hold, constantly creating a feedback loop. His own immortality was basically turning the implants fatal, almost like an accelerated form of cancer. Lorgar realized that the World Eater's Primarch had only a few months left to live, so Lorgar pitches an idea to Angron for them to go to his home. He convinces that Angron should take the Shadow Crusade back to Nuceria. On paper, to Angron's belief, this was to find the original slavers who built the nails in order to force them to explain the technology so Lorgar could save Angron's life and give him a modicum of freedom. Then they could burn the whole world to ash. And in his now mentally reduced state, Angron would change his stance, which originally was just to let go. Nuceria didn't matter. He had left that all behind. But in his now maddened, mentally damaged state, Lorgar was able to appeal to the revenge that Angron felt he had been denied by the Emperor decades ago. But Lorgar actually had a hidden agenda. He didn't actually care if the Nucerians could fix the implants. Lorgar fully intended to drag his dying brother into the immortal embrace of the Dark Gods, turning him into a demon prince whether Angron wanted it or not. And seeing as Angron considered it another form of slavery, he really didn't want it. This was opposed to Angron's desire for a noble death, won upon the battlefield. So the world eaters would descend upon Nuceria, finally beginning to purge the world that had tortured and damaged their father. But just as Angron was getting his long-awaited violent catharsis, the sky lights up. Rabu Guilliman had been tracking them since the massacre at Calth, out of the warp at the edges of the Nucerian system, with a battered ragtag, yet massive armada of at least 41 ships, led by his flagship Courage Above All. Guilliman was out for blood, and the Ultramarines immediately launched a desperate, hyper-aggressive void battle, throwing everything and anything they could at Lorgar's flagship, while simultaneously trying to board Angron's own, the Conqueror. And so the stage was perfectly set for one of the most brutal family reunions in all of history. So up in orbit, things are completely falling apart for the traitors, but this isn't your standard calculated space warfare battle, which we've seen before. This was an incredible, very personal grudge match. The Ultramarines aren't just trying to win a total victory in an efficient way. They are out for absolute cold-blooded revenge for the betrayal at Calth. Guilliman has brought his fleet in fully and aggressively as they sweep over the traitor ships like an angry swarm of hornets. They're hemorrhaging drop pods and gunships, doing whatever it takes to punch through the defensive lines and force a planetfall. Over on the World Eater's flagship, the Conqueror, their legendary human commander, Lotara Serene, puts up a brilliant and desperate defense, turning several Ultramarine ships into flaming wreckages in orbit. But there are simply too many of them, and eventually the Loyalists breach the hulls and start boarding. Meanwhile, Lorgar's massive flagship, Fidelitas Lex, gets decimated, as Guilliman is directing the battle from his own ship, Courage Above All, and he's using a death by 1,000 cuts strategy. The Lex is being subjected to strafing runs and constant broadside attacks. Its shields are now gone, its armor is cracking, and the massive Gothic cathedrals upon its spines are being blown to bits. It's horrific, it's close up, it's a slugfest in any other term, between massive capital ships, with both sides taking massive uncountable casualties. This leads a crew of the Lex to start abandoning ship in their escape pods, while the colossal vessel just keeps rolling and firing its remaining cannons in light of its own burning hull. Because both traitor ships are cut off from each other, they are swarmed, meaning they're basically left to fight alone. While the Conqueror is distracted trying to repel boarders, a wave of Ultramarine drop pods finally is able to break the blockade and hammers into the surface of Nuceria. The doors blow open and the 13th Legion pours out in perfect synchronized formations. But what makes this scene so incredibly chilling is when the World Eaters look at these Ultramarines, they realize these are the shiny cobalt blue poster boys of the Imperium. Their armor is scorched, cracked, covered in scars of battles they had fought only a few weeks ago. These are the hardened survivors of Calth, and they aren't here to bring Imperial compliance. They are here with a cold and terrifying intensity to wipe the word bearers from existence. What happens next is a clash of three completely different ways of making war. As usual, the Ultramarines immediately start setting up defensive perimeters and calculated strongpoints in order to secure landing zones. But they are crashing headfirst into the World Eaters, who are now fighting like a pack of rabid wolves, driven completely insane by the Butcher's nails. The World Eaters themselves are hurling wave after wave of bodies into the Ultramarines' lines, in a storm of roaring axes, completely enslaved to the joy of violence and the ecstasy that the Butcher's nails provide. And then you have the Word Bearers, who match the Ultramarines' cold vengeance with pure, frantic, fanatical hatred. They march into the gunfire chanting hymnals from the Book of Lorgar, carrying horrific bone-strewn icons across the battle. It is a complete and total nightmare across the surface of Nuceria. This sets the stage for the Primarchs to cross paths themselves. As the ground war on Nuceria reaches a fever pitch, the sky itself seems to fall. The burning, broken shell of the Fidelitas Lex finally loses its battle with gravity, cutting through the clouds in a slow and agonizing descent. The massive plasma engines drag the stern down first, and the ship, a vessel that held thousands upon thousands of souls, slams down into the Nucerian ocean with a force that defies description. But on the battlefield, no one is looking to the sky. They are looking to the center of the carnage, where Reboot Guilliman has finally found the man he's been hunting across the stars, Lorgar Aurelian. And here there are no grandiose speeches. It's just two brothers who absolutely loathe each other's existence. Guilliman, the master of logic and empire building, against Lorgar, the prophet of chaos. They fall upon each other in a clash of power fist against War Maul. Upon the resulting explosion of energy fields, a shockwave so violent surges through the ranks that it drops many of their sons who are too near the chaos. But neither Primarch blinks. They are moving at a blur of godlike speed, so fast the human eye can't even track them, not even the augmented eyes of a space marine. As even in the best of circumstances, they would be barely able to keep track of Guilliman's righteous anger as he swung at his brother, battering his chest in, as Lorgar fights back with his own desperate burst of telekinetic power along with his own Crozius, being able to hit with the force of a cannonball. By the time they pause, they are both broken and bleeding internally and externally. Fractured skulls, missing teeth, eyes barely holding their place inside skulls, the works, under a grey ash-choked sky. But then the atmosphere of the fight changes. Out of the Ultramarines' ranks bursts a nightmare, clad in crimson. Not crimson of armor, but rather the crimson of blood. Angron, his armor shattered, wrecked, and ravaged, is absolutely drenched in the blood of the slain, and he's roaring with a fury that makes any of the previous duel seem like a formal tap dance. And here, unfortunate detail occurs. Angron is now wearing a bandolier of skulls, and these aren't just random trophies, they're the remnants of his brothers and sisters from the mass grave at Desheka. He carried them across the planet so their empty eye sockets could finally witness the destruction of the world that had enslaved them. Even through the agonizing biting and ticking of the butcher's nails, Angron is finally satisfied. He wants his dead family to taste blood one last time before he passes, and he knows he's passing. That is obvious to him at this point. So Angron doesn't just join the fight, he takes it over. He launches himself at the blue-clad Guilliman with a murderous hatred that had been simmering for decades, not just at Guilliman, but at everything the loyal son represented. The duel between Lorgar and Guilliman evaporates automatically as Angron forces the Ultramarines' Primarch back with a relentless storm of chainsword strikes. For Guilliman, this isn't a tactical challenge anymore. This isn't revenge. It's a desperate struggle for survival against a force of nature that has finally rent free from its human shackles. The Red Angel has come home, and he's bringing the ghosts of the past with him. But this didn't just happen immediately. Angron had been here much longer. After arriving on Nuceria, Angron doesn't start slaughtering. Rather, after a century or more of bitterness, the first thing he does is go back to the mountains. He climbs the Sheka's ridge to find the bones of his battered and slain brothers and sisters, the ones he was forced to abandon. And they're still there, not even given a proper burial. They're just bleached ribs, cracked skulls, and rent, decayed clothing, exposed to the elements exactly where the Nucerian armies had left them. Here, memories hit him like a physical blow. But then, he goes into the city-state of Desha, to see who's running the show now. And he hears the official stories. The High Riders had spent a century telling everyone that Angron was a coward, that he had tucked his tail and fled at the final moments of the revolt, leaving his family to die alone. All the while, Angron had carried his family with him to this moment. And that's where the last thread of Angron's restraint snaps, and all the built-up anger spills out like a deluge of unrestrained wrath. He was a Primarch who had suffered every waking second for a century because he had been stolen from his death, only to find out the people who had tortured, tormented, and mutilated him had turned your tragedy into a lie about your honor being non-existent. Angron doesn't just get mad. He goes full world leader wrath upon them. He orders his legion to kill everyone in the city, and then he orders them to kill every last soul on the planet, be they intelligent or not. Everything. is to be ground into a paste. The moment this world starts to burn is when Lorgar is intercepted by the vengeful Reboot Guilliman, and the two are engaged in the aforementioned duel, which leaves Lorgar mostly a bleeding, crumbled mess of a man. And just as Guilliman raises his hand for the killing blow, Angron, plastered in gore and wrath, wearing a bandolier of his dead kingsman's skulls, roars into the fray in order to save his brother, not knowing that his brother had planned to damn him all along. As Angron and Guilliman are trading blows that would level a building, there is an unfortunate glancing strike from Guilliman's power fist that catches Angron across the chest, causing one of the ancient fragile skulls from the ridge to shatter. A piece of the only people that Angron ever truly loved was rent from him and falls to the dirt. It is at this moment, in the heat of the struggle, that Guilliman finally realized that he messed up. As he takes a step back, his armor boot crushes what is left of the skull into fine white powder. The howl that comes from Angron in that very moment isn't even human anymore. It's a sound of impossible anguish, and it's practically tearing the air apart. He proceeds to throw himself at the Blue Boy Scout with a rage that defies reality. In this specific peak moment of absolute emotional and physical trauma, as the final embers of his life are burning away, Lorgar springs his trap. This was what he had been waiting for. As the blood of Nuceria soaks into the soil and Angron's soul screams into the warp, the ritual begins. The Red Angel is about to die, and something eternal, something demonic, something vile, evil, and disgusting is about to take his place. Nuceria began as a cage that broke a god, and it ends as an altar where a monster was to be born. This is when the very human tragedy of Angron becomes less a story about a man and one of cosmic horror. As Guilliman had crushed the final fragile piece of Angron's humanity, Lorgar used this opening. He felt the warp boil behind the veil of reality, and he started chanting in a language that shouldn't exist, in a tongue that was never spoken by anything with a soul. His voice now matches Angron's pure scream of torment in a perfect, sickening harmony. Lorgar isn't just watching the transformation happen, he is a conductor. He tears the sky over Nuceria open, summoning the very ruin storm to the planet. This is not just a storm, it's a crimson torrent, made of ghosts of 100 murdered worlds, and it starts raining blood upon Nuceria. Here, Lorgar calls out to the Neverborn, entities we call demons, to witness the birth of their new king. Lorgar locks Angron's muscles, and he literally sets the synapses of his brain alight. The Butcher's nails, which were already a nightmare, suddenly become overclocked by the raw power of the imperium. Angron's blood turns to quicksilver, then lava, and then finally a kind of holy fire that is wholly unholy. His body begins to tear itself apart, glowing, growing, shifting into something massive and terrifying. This is his apotheosis, his perfection, after a lifetime of being broken. However, when Lorgar thinks he's saving his brother, the last remaining world eaters that see the truth act. They see their father being slain only to have another chain placed on him, being turned from a slave who will eventually be free into a slave eternal. These were the last remaining World Eater librarians, and they were the only warriors in the Legion who never took the nails, because the implants were a death sentence for Xikers, and even Angron realized this. They realized that Lorgar was dragging Angron into an eternal damnation, one which he would never have any freedom from, one which he would always suffer from the torment of the nails, and they decided to make one final desperate last stand. All 19 librarians linked their minds and souls together to form a gestalt consciousness called the Communion. This was a massive psychic entity, a collective of soul shields that actually managed to pull Angron's soul out of the middle of Lorgar's ritual. Inside the warp, the Communion and Lorgar would engage in a titanic clash of wills, both sides genuinely believing that they were the ones saving Angron. The librarians wanted to give their father the peace of death he so longed for. Lorgar wanted to give him the gift of immortality, but Lorgar, being a Primarch and a master of the dark arts, along with having the backing of all 4 chaos gods at this moment, was just as powerful in the warp as he was in reality, and he was able to break the Communion, shattering the minds of the librarians and forcing the transformation of his brother into a grisly completion. When the dust settles, Angron is gone, and in his place the demon Primarch was born, a towering avatar of Khorne's bottomless rage. And the first thing this new monster does, he looks at the librarians. For decades, Angron hated his own psychers, not because they were less than, not because of anything individual, but rather because psychers, by their mere presence, made the butcher's nails sing in wrath. And now, with his monster brain, he looks at the librarians, and he feels it bleed in agony. To him, they had been a constant source of agony, but still loyal sons. Now, seeing them wounded, trying to attack Lorgar, the brother who saved his so-called soul, decided it was time for one final culling. The tragedy of Nuceria was over, and the eternal nightmare of the World Eaters had begun. Angron just hadn't woken up as a monster. He woke up with a checklist, and he immediately turns towards the surviving librarians, butchering them, but eliminating the last connection the Legion had to the old warhounds when they weren't completely consumed by the nails, but to the blood god Khorne, who now claimed Angron as his own. Magic and psychic powers were nothing but an insult, so wiping them out systematically was what he set Angron about. And with their deaths, the Legion was now purified for Khorne. Everything except pure mindless slaughter was gone. Lorgar had promised the World Eaters to Khorne without their knowledge or desire, and by the time the dust settled on Nuceria, the contract had been fulfilled and signed in the blood of Angron and his own sons. As for Rabut Guilliman, he barely made it out alive, retreating from the surface, wounded and shaken, unable to even wrap his mind around the level of corruption he had just witnessed. He didn't just lose a battle, he watched two of his brothers transcend humanity and become something simultaneously more than and less than they had ever been. One of them transformed into something that literally shouldn't exist in the logical universe. With the Ultramarines gone, the World Eaters finished what they started. They don't just kill armies, they reduce the entire planet of Nuceria to a burning cinder. Every city, every record, every living thing, not just humans, but even just plants and other life forms, gone. And once it was done, the new demon Primarch Angron just shook the dust off the world and took off with his fleet, never looking back. The planet that had defined his existence for over a century didn't matter anymore. He had finally outgrown his cage by becoming a monster and a slave once more. Fast forward to the aftermath of the Horus Heresy. Usually the Imperium was very exterminatus-y about traitor Primarch worlds, as they loved to go back to those homeworlds and blow them up into space dust just for the principle of it. But with Nuceria, they didn't even bother. There was nothing left to kill. Angron had already done the Inquisition's job for them. The planet had been a graveyard, wiped clean, to the point that not even a taint was left to purge. The world had never even been used to draw recruits from, like all the other Primarch planets had been. The High Lords essentially would then just issue an Edict of Obliteration, scrubbing all records of Nuceria from the map, and every star chart, just in case, hoping that if they stopped talking about it, the memory of what happened would just evaporate. But you can't really delete a tragedy like this, can you? Even with its name gone from official records, Nuceria stands as this permanent, silent testament, a graveyard, and a tomb for the absolute worst parts of humanity, something completely preventable, left to fester for too long. And with it, the story of how cruelty begets cruelty, how a father's coldness can break a son, and how a world built on blood and slaughter from arenas eventually just drowned in that very same blood. It's the short time here that is truly the origin story of the Red Angel. But more than that, it's a warning that in the grim darkness of the far future, sometimes the only thing left of a world is a hole it left in the galaxy. And for Angron, that hole is shaped exactly like the brothers and sisters he lost in the mountains 100 years before the end of his humanity. Thank you for staying with me while I talk about my favorite Traitor Legion's homeworld, even though there's not much of the homeworld to actually speak about. But I do really have to say, liking and commenting on this video really does help me in the algorithm, and subscribing is an awesome way to stay up to date with the videos I post.